I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about housing, and in particular, I'll focus on social housing, and I'm going to try and focus a little bit on something that's a little bit unusual, which is I just really want to bring in some regional themes as well, because I'm of the view that what is happening in regional New South Wales right now is particularly catastrophic and sometimes doesn't get the kind of presence in the mainstream Sydney media that it deserves. The regional media have actually been covering this pretty well, but maybe we don't all see what's in, the kind of local win down in Bega or the Border Mail in Albury. So I'm going to sort of maybe just try and bring in a couple of regional examples just because I think it's a really important part of the conversation we're having. I'll try and talk for maybe like 20 minutes. I'll see how I go, but definitely want to leave time for questions and just feedback and comments because I think this is a conversation that is incredibly important for Labor people. Housing is central Labor business, and I'll sort of just finish up on why I think that is at the end of my comments. So just to kind of start off, I think we can all accept that we're in a housing crisis right now in New South Wales. Statistics don't paint the whole story, but they are illuminating. We have seen house prices increase by 30% in Sydney. In some areas of regional New South Wales, such as Snowy Monero, we have seen a 50% increase. In a lot of other areas in the regions, it's overall close to 30% as well. In Lismore, which has obviously been in the news recently, house prices have doubled in the past 5 years. And I use that as an example because in those areas of regional New South Wales where we've had natural disasters, the housing crisis predates the impact of those natural disasters. And that's a really important point that we need to remember. This is not just something that has come about as a result of floods and fires. This has come about because of a systematic and systemic market failure that predates any of those sort of catastrophic and unpredictable events. The median house price in Sydney at the moment is $1.6 million. That is the median Sydney house price is $1.6 million. In Melbourne, it's $1.1 million. That is an unbelievable amount of money. Ahuri, which is the kind of peak housing think tank for any of you housing keen beans out there who are not across Ahuri's work, I really recommend them. They're Melbourne-based and they do some excellent housing research. They found that there was not a single LGA in Sydney that had affordable house prices for a low-income worker. People like delivery drivers, childcare workers, even early career fire and emergency services workers were completely priced out of the Sydney housing market. In a town like Albury, as I said, I'm going to use regional examples occasionally, that's been a $150,000 increase in house prices in recent years. So we just know that housing is now catastrophically unaffordable in Sydney and in regional New South Wales. There's another side to the housing crisis, and that's got a little bit of coverage recently, and that's the rent price increase. Rents have increased by substantial amounts in recent years. There has been a 20% increase in rent in regional New South Wales in the past 12 months. For rents to go up 20% in 12 months is a phenomenally high increase over a short period of time. The rate of increase in Sydney is around 13 to 15%. So the consequence of the rent increase in particular, there are two things I just want to quickly highlight. One is just overall housing stress. A lot of lower income people are renters. Some of them have mortgages and, we know that the projected increase in interest rates is going to really hurt those people, but a lot of low income people are renters. And more of them are living in acute housing stress. That is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, on rent or mortgage. So as rents go up, the percentage of people who are just experiencing housing stress every day, every week, every month also goes up. And, that has really severe consequences for the type of society that we're living in. Of course, and again, I think Labor people, we need to emphasise this hurts the most vulnerable. So in many areas of regional New South Wales, over 70% of low and very low income people are in housing stress. That's just such a large number of people who cannot afford housing based on the incomes that they have because rent has increased so much. So it's really hurting people. They are struggling to pay the increased rents. I know that when I visit sort of drop-in shelters and neighbourhood shelters in places like Coffs Harbour, as I said, in Bega, in Albury, in the central west of New South Wales, they're telling me that people are coming in for food, for energy vouchers, that have jobs. These are not people that are on government benefits. These are people that are working people, that have jobs, that have never asked for help before, but because their rent has gone up so much, they're now seeking food relief. They're now needing energy vouchers. They're now needing to reach out for charity just to cover the basics that weren't really a problem for them before we started seeing the kind of inflation that we've seen in house prices particularly and rent prices recently. The other consequence of the rent price increase particularly is low vacancy. Low vacancy rates is a huge problem. It's not just an affordability problem, it's an availability problem. And what that means is that people are being evicted halfway through their tenancy so that the landlord can increase the rent or put the property on Airbnb. And we shouldn't discount or not include a conversation about the impact of short-term letting, particularly in regional New South Wales. So people, they sign a lease, they think, look, I've got a house for 12 months or 24 months. Halfway through that period, they're given 3 months' notice to vacate. They just cannot find anywhere else to live. There's no availability. That these people are desperately looking around, posting messages on local sort of community groups and Facebook groups often, saying, I have references, I have a good rental history, I'm being evicted through no fault of my own, so that the landlord can increase the rent to take advantage of higher rent prices or put the property on Airbnb. And now literally I have nowhere else to live. And the vacancy rates in most areas of regional New South Wales are close to 0%. There's literally nothing. A property comes on the market and there are 60, 70, 80 applications. We saw an instance in Hinchinbrook in southwest Sydney earlier this year where a good family home came on the market to rent at a decent rate, and there was so many people coming to inspect the property that the police needed to be called. The street was closed because there was literally chaos as hundreds of people descended on a suburban street in Hinchinbrook because of an open house. That's how stressed the rental market is right now. So those are some of the consequences of the rent price increase and the house price increase. Some of the other consequences are increased homelessness. So a number of the people who I mentioned are evicted from their properties. They just cannot find anywhere else to live. They're living in forms of homelessness right now. Now, most of the time that's not rough sleeping, but as we all know, that's the tip of the iceberg. That's the small little part of homelessness that we see. Underneath, there's couch surfing, there's living in cars, there's living in tents, there's living in caravans. These are all things that we are seeing a really significant increase of, particularly in the regions where people are evicted from their properties as the rent goes up. They just cannot find anywhere else to live. And as I said, these are people with jobs. I heard a story when I was in Bega last week of someone who works for Service New South Wales who's living in her car. I've heard of teachers living in caravan parks in Braidwood. I've heard of teachers camping in tents on showgrounds near Bellingen on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. These are people who should not be unable to secure stable housing in New South Wales, and yet because the crisis is so out of control, they're experiencing what are forms of homelessness. And the government has no real solutions for that problem right now. Want to mention two groups in particular that I'm really worried about in that category, and that's women and children fleeing domestic violence and women over 55. There was research earlier this year from Equity Economics which showed that thousands of women every year are returning to the homes of violent perpetrators because they cannot secure alternative housing. So they leave, They make that difficult decision to leave, and we all know how hard that is. They go to crisis accommodation, they go to a refuge, but that's only very short term. There is no housing, affordable housing for them to access after that, and so they are returning to the homes of violent perpetrators. Women over 55 are the fastest growing group of homeless in New South Wales, women over 55. Again, these are women who have never interacted with social services before. Most of the time they've worked their whole lives, normally part-time, combined with unpaid care work. They don't have a lot of superannuation. Maybe there's a marriage breakdown, maybe there's an illness, something happens, and they are now experiencing forms of homelessness. And these are women who find it extremely difficult to access traditional social services. And traditional social services are not geared to support people in that category. The government hasn't caught up with the consequences of the housing crisis. Where would, in our vision for society, what would be the solution for a number of these people? Well, it would be social housing. Social housing should be there to provide housing solutions for people like women and children leaving domestic violence, women over 55 who don't have any assets. And so what has been the consequence of this catastrophic housing crisis on the social housing sector? Well, the waiting list has massively peaked. It's now over 53,000 in New South Wales. The priority waiting list, which is people who are urgently needing social housing and at risk of homelessness, is almost 10,000. In many parts of New South Wales, the wait time for social housing is over 10 years. So actually it means that wait list number that I just quoted is kind of bullshit, because a lot of the time what happens is that people go, I can't afford housing. I can't possibly afford to buy a house. I can't afford rent anymore. I need assistance from social housing. They go to the Department of Communities and Justice and they say, I think I'm eligible for social housing. I'd like to go on the waiting list. How long is that going to take? And they say 10 years, a decade. And the person goes, oh, forget it. What's the point in that? See you later. They don't even add their name. So we know that there are a lot more people who would be eligible for social housing who aren't even on the list because the time is so long. And what's happening in New South Wales at the moment? Well, we're going backwards in terms of social housing. That's what's happened. As a percentage of total housing stock, social housing is going backwards. In terms of government investment per capita in this state, we're going backwards. In Victoria, the state government there has invested over $5 billion in new social and affordable housing. In New South Wales, they fast-tracked $800 million, which was just money that they pre-committed. I don't know if people remember the future directions for social housing policy that the government released a few years ago. It was also called Communities Plus. This was a big announcement they made in 2016. This was their big social housing plan. $2 billion, I think, was the price tag at that time. They were going to deliver 23,000 dwellings over the next 10 years. So that's 2016 to 2026, 23,000 dwellings. It's now 2022. So we're pretty solidly into the 10 years timeframe on that policy. And figures that have just been released from questions that I asked at budget estimates indicate that the total number of social housing completions is less than 3,000. They committed to building 23,000 dwellings over 10 years, and just over halfway through, they've completed 3,000 of the 23,000, just under 3,000. Last year, in the 2020-2021 year, they completed 500 dwellings. 500 dwellings added in the year. And when you take away the number of dwellings that they sold in that period, the actual net addition to the social housing stock was something like 200. 200 properties a year. We have over 53,000 people on the list. As I said, we know the number eligible is considerably more substantial than that. That is, by any measure, one of the most serious government policy fails I think I've ever seen. And one of the sad things, and it's really great that the Fabians is conducting this conversation, because I'm really outraged about what's happening in social housing. The government is cutting money from the program. It is not investing in new housing. We have women and children fleeing domestic violence. We have women over 55 being the fastest growing rate experiencing homelessness, and the government adds 200 properties a year to its social housing stock. It's an absolute outrage. But unfortunately, sometimes social housing isn't always, the kind of sexiest thing that people want to talk about, but it's so incredibly important that we do have these conversations about how we can ensure as a society that people have access to what is their human right, which is safe and secure housing. And social housing is an absolutely critical element of that. Just briefly, I want to mention that not only are they absolutely failing to invest in social housing, such that we literally had 200 new properties added to the stock in the entire of last year, they've also massively cut funding in maintenance. So the social housing stock that we do have is old, it's ageing. And with all of the rain that we had, oh my God, the number of people that have contacted my office alone, let alone their local member's office, about mould and leaking is through the roof. The government just does not invest in maintenance. And so a lot of these properties are old, they're run down, they're not dignified places for people to live. The University of Wollongong did research which showed that half of people in social housing experienced unsafe and unhealthy temperatures during winter. That's temperatures in which the World Health Organization says it's unsafe and unhealthy for a person to live. Half of people in New South Wales social housing were in that category because there's such poor quality dwellings and the government is not investing in maintenance. And why do they not invest in maintenance? Well, first of all, they don't care about social housing. But secondly, it's a specific program to run down the stock to sell it. They have now raised over $3 billion privatising social housing since they got elected to government. $3 billion selling social housing. And some of those things people would be familiar with, sort of Sirius, the building, and Miller's Point, some of those kind of more iconic properties that were sold. But it's much broader than that. It's much broader than that. It is just a wholesale sell-off of social housing. And they claim that they reinvest that money in new stock. They don't. They just don't. That's just not accurate. As I said, they added 200 properties to the overall stock last year. They just don't do that. And so we are just seeing all of this there's all these valuable assets, this valuable land, these valuable housing assets just flogged off by the government and then quietly not reinvesting that money in social housing and hoping they're not going to be called out for it. And obviously I'm trying to call them out for it as much as I can and be as loud and as noisy about it as possible, because it's absolutely terrible what is happening to people. I also want to just mention, because I do think that this is important, one of the issues that we have with the housing sector in New South Wales is flat wages. We know that because the cost of housing, the cost of so many things is going up so astronomically and wages are so flat. That's one of the reasons that's really driving the unaffordability crisis. And again, I think the New South Wales government really has a case to answer here, because its policy of wage capping in the public sector is really sort of leading by example when it comes to flat wages. And so it's not directly linked to housing in some instances, but I think it's a really important part of a conversation we're having about how do we fix this problem in a way? What's our solution? What are the sort of levers that we want to look to pull to make housing more affordable for people? And I don't think as Labor people we can have that conversation. We can have a conversation about stock. We can have a conversation about more social housing. We can have a conversation about the planning system. They're all really important parts. We can have a conversation about the federal tax system, which is also critical, and I'm sure that many of you would agree with that. But I don't think as Labor people we can have that conversation and not just acknowledge that flat wages and government wages policy, that cap and depress wages, is an important part of that conversation. I just think it has to be for Labor people. So a little bit in terms of what some of the other solutions that Labor's come up with. We already announced in our budget reply last year a massive investment in social housing maintenance. As I said, that's a real problem. We not only think that that is good because people deserve dignified places to live, it's good for economic growth, it's good for driving economic activity. Those are jobs for people, for plumbers and carpenters and tilers and all that kind of stuff, which is excellent. It's exactly what government should be doing. The third element of it from our point of view was we wanted a really large greening program to help make our social housing stock, which, as I said, is a bit dated, a little bit more green and clean, and make a contribution to our emissions reductions. Things like solar panels on the roofs of social housing properties, things like double glazing, things like insulation. There's no reason why we can't make our social housing stock carbon neutral. And that's another excellent reason, in my view, to invest in social housing maintenance. We also do want to just see a substantial increase in the number of social and affordable housing dwellings. Now, in the context of the federal election, there's a real choice here. I mean, I know I don't need to convince you people, but in terms of what we want to tell our families and friends, Jason Clare, the federal Shadow Minister for Housing, has put $10 billion on the table for the Housing Future Fund. That is a massive commitment from federal Labor. That's not small fries. $10 billion to invest in social and affordable housing in this country. I mean, that's right up there with the kind of, game-changing investment that we saw from Labor during the global financial crisis, when Tanya Plibersek was the housing minister, and we really saw leadership from the federal government on housing. So, in terms of, if you're interested in housing, I'm interested in housing, and people are interested in housing in the context of the federal election, and they're saying, well, what are the policy differences here? I mean, I think that is an absolutely critical one that we should really be touting, particularly, as I said, in the regions. They've combined that with a number of other kind of specific regional housing affordability programs, some of those particularly targeted to the northern rivers of New South Wales, because, of course, as I mentioned, yes, the housing crisis was pre-existing, but oh my God, it is going to be completely catastrophic for that part of New South Wales, and we are going to see some incredibly dire housing outcomes there. So Labor's sort of had some specific things to say about that too, but there are some really significant policies with big dollars attached that Labor has put on the table for the federal election, and I think we should really be touting this, because my view, and, look, hey, I talk about housing all the time. So, maybe I'm in a kind of like, world in which, housing isn't as big an issue as I think it is. But I have to say, the conversations that I have with people, whether I'm in the regions or out in Western Sydney, I think housing affordability is an absolutely huge issue for so many people. And I think Labor's got a really important story to tell there. So, I've probably talked for enough. As I said, more than happy to answer questions and just hear feedback, be part of a conversation. I do just want to finish on this, which is why I think housing is so important, why I'm really glad the Fabians were keen to have this conversation tonight, and why all of you were keen to come along is, to me, I think housing is the foundational issue for social justice. I don't think we can have serious policies to pursue all of the outcomes that we want to see in all of the areas of society to make it just and fair and equal without fixing housing front and centre. You can't get a job or hold down a job if you don't have a place to live, if you're living in a car. How do you shower? How do you get dressed? How do you tell your employer where you're living if you're essentially homeless or on the brink of homelessness? How do you complete your schooling? How do you get your education? We know that children who experience homelessness have considerably poorer educational outcomes. How do you go to uni? How do you go to TAFE if you don't have housing, if you don't have a place to put your head at the end of the night to do your study? How do you look after your health? We know people who experience housing stress and homelessness have far poorer health outcomes, and of course that's obvious. How do you prioritise your health, your mental health, your dental health, if you don't have housing? So for all of those issues, which are all incredibly important, they are education, employment, health. Without housing, to me, we can sort of look at those issues and go, okay, there's a policy here and a policy there, and they're important policies. But if people are on the brink of housing stress all the time, they just cannot secure tenancies, they can't possibly enter the housing market, they're paying higher and higher mortgages as interest rates go up, they're paying higher and higher rent as rent prices go up. Well, completing our vision for all of those other areas of society is going to be so much harder, almost impossible, I would argue, without fixing housing. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to talk about housing and to be part of a conversation with Housing for You, because for me it is foundational for our vision for social justice. So I'll probably just leave it there, but as I said, happy to answer questions or just hear comments or whatever. Thanks for having me.